She sat alone, staring at the suspension papers, the ink still fresh. The room around her was quiet, too quiet for someone who had spent most of her adult life inside roaring cockpits. Why had they taken it all away? Why had the same hands that once pinned wings on her chest now ripped them off in disgrace? Captain's uniform still carried the insignia of flight, but officially she was grounded. No missions. No sky. No chance to prove herself again. 28 years old, 5 years of perfect service, 2 bronze stars, more combat hours than men twice her age, and all of it shattered in one brutal hearing. But was she reckless? Or was she just the only one willing to trust her instincts when soldiers' lives depended on it? That question echoed in her head as she sat inside the concrete box they called quarters at airfield. Outside, helicopters thundered into the night sky in perfect formations, following neat flight paths she could fly in her sleep. They didn't need her. At least, that's what her commanders told her. She wasn't disciplined enough. She wasn't safe enough. But something inside her refused to accept that verdict. Something her father had taught her when she was only a girl skimming crop fields in Nebraska in an old flying lower than power lines just to learn how the air moved. He used to tell her, "The sky has moods, learn them, and you'll always be one step ahead of danger." Those moods, she could feel them even now, though no wind touched her skin. The sting of the review still burned. She remembered the words too clearly. General hadn't even looked at her service record before branding her a liability. "Cowboys," he'd said, "have no place in modern military aviation." And then louder, for everyone in the room to hear, "especially not a female pilot trying to play hero." The sentence cut deeper than the suspension itself. She wasn't just punished for one maneuver. She was accused of setting back every woman who dared step into combat aviation. And yet she couldn't regret it. That canyon run had saved 8 Marines. 8 men who had written her messages she still hadn't opened. 17 unread notes sitting in her phone. "Thank you. You saved my life." Words she couldn't bring herself to read because gratitude meant nothing when her career was being dismantled in silence. Her hand traced the edges of her flight wings pinned to her chest. Metal and fabric meaningless now. The real weight sat in her chest, pressing harder with each passing hour. 3 days, that's how long she lasted in silence. 3 days before the chaos broke out. Operation Mountain Storm. A nightmare. 17 Rangers stranded in a valley the maps labeled Devil's Throat. 3 rescue attempts already lost. 2 shot from the sky. 1 Chinook barely limping back with holes in its skin. The enemy owned the ridges. Anti-aircraft fire turned the sky into a death trap. From outside the briefing room could see the tactical map through the glass. She wasn't allowed inside, but her eyes stayed locked on the glowing lines. The valley was narrow, 200 meters across at its widest, twisting into a canyon with turns so sharp even the manuals called them impractical for rotary craft. The only way in was through that canyon. The only way out was the same. Every pilot in that room knew it was suicide. She watched them one by one, brave men and women she respected, shaking their heads, refusing the mission. Not out of cowardice, out of reality. By-the-book flying said it couldn't be done. But she had flown spaces. She had danced her bird sideways through walls of rock because she knew how to read the air, not just the instruments. Every gust, every downdraft, every invisible river of pressure bouncing off the cliffs, she could feel it. She had trained for it her entire life without even knowing it. And yet she stood outside, silenced, grounded, invisible. Until the door burst open. Colonel stood there, eyes hollow with fatigue. And behind him, the same general who tried to erase her career looked like he was swallowing glass. They needed her. They both knew it. Couldn't even raise his eyes when he muttered about extraordinary circumstances. His voice cracked when he admitted no pilot on the base could do it. And then Major General Reeves stepped forward, the man commanding ground forces. His son was among the trapped Rangers. His composure shattered as he begged, not ordered, but begged her to fly. She didn't hesitate, Not for a second. Minutes later, she was back in a cockpit. The machine beneath her hands felt like home again, humming, waiting. Her crew, loyal, unflinching, volunteered despite knowing the odds. They trusted her when the generals didn't. That trust was enough. The canyon rose before them like a black mouth ready to swallow steel. Her fingers tightened on the controls. She whispered under her breath, not to God, not to fate, but to the helicopter itself. "Talk to me. Let's do this." The first turn came fast, 40 knots, too slow for safety, too fast for hesitation. Enemy fire crackled overhead, ricocheting off canyon walls, but she slipped into the curve, banking harder than doctrine ever allowed. The walls pressed closer. The rotors shivered from the echoing vortexes. Most pilots would lose orientation here. She read the currents like water, guiding the aircraft where the air wanted it to go. The second turn she pushed harder. Her gunners held their fire, waiting, trusting her to hold the line. Her heart slammed against her ribs, but she felt calm, more alive than she'd felt since the day they grounded her. The third turn opened into Devil's Throat. There they were. 17 Rangers in a shrinking circle, nearly out of ammo, their eyes wide as the impossible happened, a sliding into a landing zone barely bigger than itself. 30 seconds on the ground. That was all they had. Gunners laying down suppressive fire. Rangers loading, dragging each other, bleeding but alive. 30 seconds. Then she pulled the machine back into the sky. Now heavier, now slower, now impossible. But she didn't flinch. Every nerve, every instinct sharpened. The return trip was hell, tracer rounds slicing past, the canyon twisting, her crew silent in the headsets. She banked, dipped, rode invisible currents no manual could chart. And then daylight, open sky, the base in sight. 17 Rangers stepped onto solid ground again, alive, breathing, saved. And the generals who had doubted her, they had no words left. Not when an entire battalion watched her land. Not when Major General Reeves stood with tears in his eyes, his son's arm around his shoulders. For the first time looked at her differently, not as a liability, not as a cowboy, but as something he couldn't explain, someone who had refused to accept impossible. But didn't care about his change of heart. She didn't need his approval. Because dignity doesn't speak, it doesn't beg, it simply acts. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling long after the base had gone quiet. Why couldn't she feel proud? Why wasn't victory enough? 17 men had walked out alive because she'd flown into the jaws of death. 17 families wouldn't be getting folded flags in the mail. By every measure of success, it was a triumph. But deep inside, something twisted. Because she knew the truth. They hadn't asked her to fly out of respect. They had begged her out of desperation. She wasn't reinstated out of belief in her skills, but because the alternative was certain death. When the mission ended, the generals looked at her like she was some miracle worker, as if her instincts were sorcery they couldn't explain. But to her, it was simple. The helicopter had spoken and she had listened. Nothing supernatural about it, nothing miraculous. Just trust, discipline, and years of listening to skis others ignored. So why did she feel so hollow? Her crew had celebrated quietly, exhausted but relieved. Martinez slapped her shoulder, saying nothing, just that heavy look of brotherhood shared only in moments where death brushed past. The rescued Rangers had embraced her, some of them whispering thanks with shaky voices that carried the weight of survival. But then, as the crowd cleared, as the adrenaline drained away, the faces of her superiors appeared again. Reeves. Their eyes didn't reflect gratitude. They reflected shame. The shame of men who had dismissed her until the world forced them to see her worth. And that burned more than anything. She closed her eyes, remembering words in the review board. Cowboys have no place in modern aviation. And yet, when the canyon swallowed hope, it was the so-called cowboy they turned to. That contradiction carved into her chest like a blade. Was she only valuable when the mission required something reckless? Would she ever be trusted for who she was, not just what impossible things she could do. She pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes, trying to push the thoughts away. But another voice surfaced, her father's. His laugh, his calloused hands on the controls of that old. Don't ever let them cage the way you fly. The sky isn't theirs to own. But here she was, caged again. The official reinstatement came at dawn. Stood stiff in front of the assembled aviators, his words clipped, almost choking him. He admitted he had been wrong. That combat demanded flexibility. That captain had set a new standard. Applause rose from the men and women in uniform. Some clapped sincerely. Others followed because it was expected. Stood still, her jaw tight. For them this was redemption. For her it felt like theater. Later in the hangar, Martinez found her sitting on a crate beside the she'd flown into Devil's Throat. The machine still bore scars from the mission, bullet holes patched, rotor blades checked and replaced. A survivor, like the crew who rode it. "You should be proud," he told her, leaning against the fuselage. "I should be," she admitted, "but I'm not." "Why not?" She looked at him, her voice flat. "Because they didn't trust me until they had no choice. That's not respect, that's desperation." Martinez stayed quiet because he knew she was right. In the days that followed, she noticed a shift. The younger pilots began watching her more closely, almost reverently. Some approached her in the mess hall, asking if she could show them how she read the winds, how she felt the helicopter's rhythm like a living thing. A few even whispered that she'd changed their whole view of flying. It should have encouraged her. Instead, it felt like pressure building on her shoulders. They looked at her like a myth. She wanted them to see her as human, flawed, unsure, fighting doubts every night. But myths are easier to worship than people. One evening, she found herself standing outside the chapel on base. She wasn't religious, never had been, but something about the silence inside pulled at her. She sat in the back pew, alone, watching the flickering of a candle. And for the first time since Devil's Throat, she let herself break. Her hands trembled. Tears she had refused to shed finally fell, not because of fear or even anger, but because she realized how much of herself she had given away to this war. Every flight, every risk, every desperate maneuver, pieces of her were being carved out. She had saved 17 lives, but what part of her had died in exchange? The door creaked. A shadow moved in the aisle. It was Major Collins, her direct commander, the only officer who had defended her at the hearing. He sat quietly beside her, saying nothing for a long while. Finally, he whispered, "They'll never understand what it cost you, but I do." She didn't answer. Her throat was too tight. "Listen," he continued, voice low, steady. "The truth is you're not reckless, you're precise. You see things they don't. And yes, that scares them. But scared or not, you saved those Rangers. And one day, maybe not today, they'll stop resenting you for it." Wiped her face with her sleeve. "And if they do, then you keep flying anyway." His words lingered with her long after he left. Weeks passed. Missions resumed. Flew again, not the suicide runs, not the impossible tasks, regular flights, routine insertions, cargo runs, dust-offs, the things any competent pilot could handle. But each time she took the controls, she felt eyes on her, watching, measuring, waiting for her to break protocol. She didn't. She flew perfectly, by the book, smooth, predictable, a model aviator. But inside, it felt like suffocating, like wearing someone else's uniform. Because she knew the truth. One day, another impossible mission would come, and when it did, they would look at her again. Not because they believed in her, but because no one else could survive it. And she wondered, how many more times could she carry the weight of being their last resort? That night she dreamed of Nebraska skis, of her father laughing as they skimmed wheat fields, of storms rolling in, winds shifting, and the sense of freedom that came from trusting the air itself. She woke with a start, heart pounding. For a moment, she wasn't sure if it was memory or prophecy. Outside in the distance, the base sirens wailed. Another mission had gone wrong. Another impossible decision was waiting. The sirens always sounded the same, a hollow wail that carried across the airfield, rising and falling like some mournful voice. But that night it felt different. It felt like an omen. She pulled on her boots and stepped outside before the call even came over the radios. Helicopters lifted into the dark sky, red lights blinking, crews rushing across the tarmac with weapons and stretchers. The base was alive, frantic, and somewhere deep inside, she already knew they'd be knocking on her door before the night was over. But not yet. Not until the situation had unraveled far enough that no one else could fix it. She stood near the hangars, watching shadows move under floodlights, the smell of jet fuel thick in the air. Somewhere out there, men were trapped. She didn't know the details. Not yet. But her gut told her this wasn't going to be routine. When the briefing finally reached her, she was summoned in the most reluctant way imaginable. A sergeant jogged across the tarmac, out of breath, handing her a slip of paper like it was radioactive. She unfolded it. A location, a unit designation, a time, nothing else. The message was clear: wait. And that waiting gnawed at her. By midnight, she was packing her quarters, her muscles twitching, her body aching to be in the air. It wasn't arrogance. It was instinct. Every fiber in her told her that someone out there needed her. But she was still in limbo, her reinstatement only days old, her standing fragile. If she pushed too hard, if she volunteered, they'd slap the reckless label back on her. So she waited. When the knock finally came, it was Major Collins. His face was grim, the lines deeper than usual. He didn't waste time on greetings. "They're stuck," he said flatly. "A convoy ambushed in the valley, 2 vehicles destroyed. The survivors pulled back to a compound, but they're running low on ammo. Enemy forces control the ridges. Conventional approach is suicide." His jaw tightened, "And they want me to fly it." Collins didn't nod, didn't need to. His silence was enough. She leaned against the wall, staring past him into the hallway. "So I'm not trusted until there's no one else left. Again." Collins's eyes softened. "You knew this was coming." She exhaled slowly. He was right, she had known. Hours later, she found herself back in the seat, molding to her like it had never left her. The crew was different this time. Younger, nervous, looking at her like she was something more than human. Their faces reflected a mix of fear and awe, as though they had been chosen to ride with the pilot who had flown into Devil's Throat and come back alive. Hated that look. She didn't want worship, she wanted partnership. The briefing had been brutal. The valley was wider than Devil's Throat, but deadlier in a different way. Multiple crossfire angles. An old Russian DK heavy machine gun mounted somewhere high, waiting to cut any bird out of the sky. The plan, as briefed, wasn't a plan at all. It was a gamble. Get in fast, land in the compound courtyard, load survivors, get out before the enemy shredded the rotors. As the bird lifted off, felt the weight settle on her chest. Not fear, not even dread, just the crushing awareness that, once again, she was carrying the burden no one else would. The flight out was quiet, too quiet. Her gunners scanned the ridges with night optics, Martinez muttering about heat signatures flickering like ghosts. Barely heard him. Her mind was elsewhere, hearing her father's voice again. "The air will always tell you the truth if you're willing to listen." She listened. The approach began smoothly, but halfway down the valley the air shifted. She felt it in the pedals first, a tremor, a warning. She banked hard, seconds before tracers lit up the night where her bird would have been. The crew jolted. One of the gunners cursed, said nothing. She had no time for words. She dropped altitude, skimming so low the rotors kicked dust and debris into storms behind them. Her headset crackled with warnings: too low, too fast, too unstable. But she trusted her hands, her instincts, the machine itself. The compound appeared suddenly, boxed in by walls, barely large enough for her landing skids. Rangers inside fired outward in desperate bursts, muzzle flashes strobing against stone. 30 seconds, Martinez barked. The slam down, the skid scraping concrete, the rotors dangerously close to the walls. Soldiers surged forward, dragging their wounded. Gunners laid suppressive fire as kept the bird trembling but steady. It was chaos, screams, gunfire, dust choking the air. And then the weight shifted. The survivors piled in, filling the cabin, blood soaking the floor. The crew chief shouted over comms, "We're full, go, go, go." Yanked the collective, the bird straining to rise under the heavy load. Bullets sparked against the fuselage. A round shattered a side window. For a split second, she felt the resist her. The weight, the altitude, the narrow walls it didn't want to climb. "Come on," she whispered through clenched teeth. "Come on." The rotors screamed, the frame vibrating like it might rip apart. And then, slowly, painfully, they lifted. But the escape was worse. Enemy fire poured down from the ridges. Tracer lines stitched the sky, some so close they burned into her vision. She banked hard, jinking left and right, every movement precise, deliberate, threading through a gauntlet that should have been death. One of the younger crew shouted in disbelief, "How the hell are we still alive?" Didn't answer. She couldn't. Her whole being was locked into the machine, her senses stretched beyond human. The valley spat them out into open air. Silence followed, the kind of silence that comes when death misses by inches. The crew erupted into laughter and shouts, relief spilling out, but stayed quiet. Her hands shook on the controls, not from fear, but from the realization that each mission like this was chipping something away inside her. Back at the base, the rescued soldiers stumbled off, some saluting, some hugging her crew, some too broken to speak. One of them, bloodied and pale, locked eyes with her as he was carried past. No words, just a look, raw gratitude. It should have been enough. But later that night, in the stillness of her quarters, she sat at her desk, staring at her reflection in the dark window. She saw the myth they thought she was, the unshakable pilot, the one who could do the impossible. And she hated it. Because inside, she felt like she was unraveling. How many more times could she be the last resort before something broke that no instinct could fix? She whispered the question into the silence, not expecting an answer, but it hung there anyway, heavy and sharp. And in the darkness, another truth settled over her like a shadow. They weren't done with her, not yet. The war wasn't finished. And neither was the sky. The hangar smelled of oil and dust, of steel warmed by the Afghan sun, stood in its shadow staring at her. Mechanics worked around her, tightening bolts, checking hydraulics, patching holes from the last mission. It looked alive and broken at the same time, much like her. How many scars could a machine take before it couldn't fly anymore? How many could a person? The question haunted her. Everywhere she went on base, eyes followed her. Younger pilots whispered when she passed. Some looked at her with awe, others with quiet resentment. Even the veterans, men who had flown combat tour long before she enlisted, treated her differently now. Not as one of them, but as something other. It wasn't respect. Not really. Respect is earned in silence, in nods, in unspoken trust. What they gave her felt closer to superstition. As though she had bargained with fate, and as long as she was in the air, maybe fate would look the other way. But she knew better. Fate doesn't bargain. At night she lay awake, every vibration of rotor blades still humming through her bones. She saw the faces of the men she'd pulled from Valley, their gratitude raw, their eyes haunted. She should have felt proud. She should have slept in peace. Instead, she lay staring at the ceiling, her chest tight with a weight she couldn't name. She wasn't scared of dying. She never had been. What terrified her was something colder, the fear of losing herself piece by piece until nothing human was left. Her father's voice returned often in those nights. The sky isn't theirs to own. Fly the way it asks you to fly. He had taught her freedom, but now every mission felt like a cage closing around her. The morning after himself sought her out. She had half expected it, some perfunctory thanks, maybe even a reluctant commendation. Instead, his words were stranger. "You make the rest of them look ordinary," he said quietly. "That's dangerous." She frowned. Dangerous how? "Because ordinary men don't like being reminded they're ordinary." She didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Over the following weeks, missions blurred together. Insertions, extractions, convoy escorts. She flew by the book, precise, predictable. No more daring canyon runs, no more improvisations. She gave them nothing they could call reckless. But still, the myth followed her. The younger pilots lingered at the edges of the hangar, watching how she moved, how she touched the aircraft like it was alive. They wanted to learn. Some even asked for her time. She began teaching them quietly, off the record. Not in classrooms, not in lectures, but in the way her father had taught her. She'd walk them to the runway and make them close their eyes, feel the crosswind against their skin. She'd put their hands on the airframe, tell them to listen to the hum of the hydraulics, the subtle shiver of the rotors before lift. "Flying isn't just numbers on a page," she told them softly. "It's conversation. You either learn to listen or you die when the air stops forgiving your mistakes." Some got it, some didn't, but those who did began to change. Their flying grew smoother, less rigid, more instinctive, and word spread. Soon half the junior pilots were seeking her out. She never bragged, she never advertised, but they came anyway. And that terrified her superiors. Because what they called regulation, she called restriction. What they called safety, she called limitation. And they couldn't control the way her influence was spreading. One night, Collins pulled her aside. His face carried the same quiet concern he'd shown in the chapel weeks earlier. "They're watching you," he said. "They always are." "No, I mean closely, too closely. Thinks you're undermining doctrine. He says you're teaching them to disobey." She shook her head. "I'm teaching them to survive. Doesn't matter what you call it. To him, it's a threat." She exhaled slowly, anger simmering under her calm. Always the same battle. Always the same double standard. Male pilots bent the rules and got praised as innovators. She bent them and they called her reckless. Or worse, dangerous. Later that night, walking back across the tarmac, she found herself staring at the stars above the mountains. They looked so free, untouchable, and she wondered what her father would say now, seeing her torn between being caged and being idolized. But there was no time for reflection. The next mission came fast, too fast. A NATO convoy had been ambushed deep in Provence, casualties unknown, survivors pinned down, enemy forces reinforced with mortars and heavy machine guns. The terrain was unforgiving, sheer cliffs, narrow valleys, unpredictable crosswinds. The briefing room crackled with tension, maps spread across the table, radios buzzing, pilots shaking their heads again. And then, inevitably, the eyes turned toward her. Sat in silence, her jaw tight. She didn't volunteer. She didn't have to. The silence in the room wrote the assignment for her. Collins finally broke it. She'll fly it. Her chest clenched. She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand why no one else ever had to be the last resort. But instead, she simply nodded. Because 17 men were waiting, and their lives weighed more than her pride. That night, as she checked her bird with Martinez, her hands lingered on the skin of the fuselage. She whispered under her breath, almost a prayer. "Just one more. Just hold together one more time." Martinez caught the words but didn't comment. He just gave her the look of a man who had already accepted whatever fate awaited them. The flight out was darker than usual. Cloud cover smothered the moon. The valleys below were shadows within shadows. Her night vision painted the world in ghostly green. Halfway to the coordinates, the first explosion tore through the night sky, mortar fire. The convoy's distress beacon pulsed on her display. They were still alive, but barely. 5 minutes, she whispered to herself. Just hold 5 more. She banked hard, weaving through the valley, skimming to avoid fire. The trembled under the strain, but she held it steady, eyes sharp, instincts sharper. As they neared the ambush site, the radio crackled with desperate voices. "We're down to last mags. Anyone out there? Anyone at all?" His voice came calm, even. "Hold on, we're coming." The words steadied the survivors. They steadied her crew. Maybe they even steadied her. When the convoy came into view, the scene was chaos, burning vehicles, sparks of gunfire from both sides, soldiers crouched behind shattered armor. The landing zone was a nightmare. Mines suspected. Crossfire angles converging. She should have turned back. Any sane pilot would have. Instead, she dropped altitude, skimming the treetops, searching for the one sliver of space where she could put the bird down. Her father's voice echoed in her head again. "The sky always gives you one way out. You just have to find it." She found it. A narrow gap half-choked with debris, barely enough space for her skids. 30 seconds, Martinez barked again. The bird slammed down. Soldiers surged forward, dragging wounded, shouting over the chaos. Bullets pinged against armor, sparks showering the night. Kept her hands firm on the controls, her eyes scanning, her breath shallow. She didn't blink, she didn't flinch. And then the shout. "RPG left ridge." Time slowed. She saw the flash, the arc, the incoming fire. And in that split second she made the choice. The one no manual could teach, no doctrine could predict. She lifted the bird, tilted hard, swung the fuselage between the rocket and the men still boarding. The explosion ripped against the tail boom, shattering metal, rocking the helicopter like a toy. The crew screamed, systems blinked red, the groaned like a wounded animal. But it held. By some miracle, or by sheer force of her will, it held. "Go, go, go," she shouted. The last soldier leapt aboard. Martinez slammed the door, yanked the collective, and the bird clawed its way back into the night sky, trailing smoke, frames shaking, alarms blaring. Somehow, impossibly, they flew. And as the valley fell behind them, as the chaos dimmed to silence, realized something she hadn't before. It wasn't just the missions taking pieces of her. It was the choice to survive. Every time she pulled the impossible from the jaws of death, she lost something inside herself, and she wondered how much she had left to give. She woke in the medical bay with the taste of metal in her mouth. The ceiling above her was white, sterile, and far too still. For a moment she thought she had died, but then the pain in her ribs reminded her she hadn't. Her last memory was the helicopter groaning under the RPG blast, smoke trailing, alarms screaming. Somehow she had landed it. Somehow they hadn't crashed. But memory blurred after that, shouting, hands pulling her out, the world spinning into darkness. Now, lying on the hospital cot, she listened to the steady beep of the monitors and the faint shuffle of boots in the hallway. Martinez sat in a chair beside her, one arm in a sling, his eyes hollow from exhaustion. When she stirred, he straightened, relief breaking across his face. "About damn time," he muttered. "You scared the hell out of us." She tried to speak, but her throat burned. The words came ragged. "The crew." "Alive," he said. "Banged up but alive, thanks to you." She closed her eyes, relief and guilt crashing together. Alive, but always at a cost. 2 hours later, Collins appeared. He didn't smile, didn't congratulate. He just stood there, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You saved them," he said flatly. "Wasn't just me." "No, but without you, none of them walk off that battlefield." Silence stretched between them. Finally he exhaled. "And now command is furious." Her brows knit. "Furious I kept them alive." "You disobeyed orders, again. That RPG should killed you. The bird's tail is half gone. Maintenance says it's a miracle you brought it back at all." She stared at him, anger rising. "So what? They'd rather I'd let 20 men die." He didn't answer right away. His jaw clenched. Says you're a danger to the program, that you're teaching others to take risks they're not ready for. She almost laughed, but it came out bitter. Funny how men call it bravery when it's their own, but when I do it, it's reckless. Collins didn't argue. He just looked at her, tired, knowing, as if he'd fought this battle himself and lost. For the next week, she was grounded again, this time for medical observation. The truth was obvious. They wanted her out of the air until the political firestorm cooled. But she wasn't left alone. The rescued convoy found her. One by one, soldiers knocked on her door, sometimes limping, sometimes bandaged, always carrying the same look. Gratitude, raw and wordless. Some tried to thank her, some just saluted. A few broke down crying in her arms, their survival too heavy to carry alone. And every visit carved deeper into her chest, because they didn't see the exhaustion in her bones, the cracks in her spirit. They saw the myth, the pilot who did the impossible, the woman who saved them when no one else would. She smiled for them, held it together, but when the door closed, she broke all over again. At night, the nightmares came, not of crashing, not of dying, but of the silence after. The silence where she was gone, and someone else had to explain to her father's ghost why his daughter had flown herself into a grave. One evening, unable to stand the walls any longer, she walked to the airfield. The sat in the hangar, stripped down, tail boom half removed, mechanics working under floodlights. It looked wounded, barely alive. She placed her hand on the fuselage, whispering under her breath, "I'm sorry, I asked too much." And in that moment, she realized something that chilled her. She was apologizing not to a machine, but to a partner. She had treated the helicopter like a shield, sacrificing it to save others, and the guilt felt no different than betraying a friend. The next morning summoned her. His office smelled of stale coffee and paper. He didn't look up from his desk when she entered. "Captain," he said coldly, "do you understand the precedent you're setting?" She held her chin high. "I saved them, that's the precedent." He slammed his hand on the desk. "You are making pilots believe they can fly outside doctrine. You are putting ideas in their heads that will get them killed." Her voice stayed calm even, or it might get them home alive. His eyes narrowed. "You are not the hero you think you are. You're a liability, and liabilities don't last long in my command." For the first time, she smiled, not with warmth, but with the quiet defiance of someone who had already decided. "Then maybe you shouldn't call me when the impossible shows up." The silence that followed was heavier than any bullet. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. She walked out without waiting for dismissal. Word spread faster than rumors usually do on base. Pilots whispered that had been challenged. That had stood her ground. Some said she'd signed her own death warrant, career-wise. Others said she'd just cemented her place as legend. Ignored both. Legends didn't bleed in the dark. Legends didn't wake shaking from dreams of burning skis. Legends didn't question if they were losing themselves with every flight. But she did. Weeks later, the next crisis came, this time worse than the rest. A forward operating base near the border had been overrun. Communications were broken. The last signal said survivors were trapped inside the outer walls, surrounded, ammunition nearly gone. Enemy reinforcements were closing in. The mission briefing was chaos. Too far for ground reinforcements, too dangerous for conventional air rescue. No safe landing zones within range. And again, eyes turned toward her. But this time, she felt something break inside. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to scream, "Find someone else. Let me breathe, let me rest." Instead, she just nodded. Because the weight of 17 Rangers, the weight of every soldier who had knocked on her door, eyes wet with gratitude, it all demanded she keep saying yes. That night she prepped the bird in silence. No jokes, no small talk. Martinez stayed near, watching her with quiet concern. Finally, he said it. "You don't have to do this." She looked at him, her voice steady but hollow. Yes, I do. The mission would be the hardest yet. Not just for the risks, not just for the terrain, but because this time she wasn't sure she had anything left to give. And yet, as she climbed into the cockpit, strapping herself into the seat that had become both prison and salvation, she whispered one last thought. If I don't come back, let it be enough. Her hands tightened on the controls. The roared to life. And once again she flew toward the impossible. The night was black, heavy with storm clouds. No moonlight to guide them, no stars to anchor the horizon. Just the hollow hum of the rotors and the weight of silence inside the cabin. Sat in the pilot's seat, her hands steady on the controls, though her chest felt like stone. Martinez sat beside her, his sling gone, his arms still stiff but functional. He hadn't asked for this mission, but he hadn't refused it either. None of them had. The crew trusted her, maybe too much. The radio crackled with fragments of desperate voices from the besieged outpost. Gunfire thundered in the background, shouts drowned by explosions. And then silence, dead air. Exhaled through her nose. That silence was worse than any scream. The plan was simple on paper. Fly into the compound. Extract survivors, fly out. But in reality it was madness. No clear LZ. Enemy positions dug in across the heavy machine guns, RPGs. The base itself half destroyed, its walls crumbling. She felt her father's voice again, faint as wind through wheat fields. The sky doesn't care about your plans. It only cares about what you can feel. So she listened, to the air, to the machine, to her own pulse. The outpost came into view as a smear of fire and smoke. Half the buildings were rubble. Muzzle flashes sparked from every angle. A few dozen figures clung to the inner yard, firing outward in desperation. They looked impossibly small against the storm of violence. Jesus, Martinez muttered, how the hell do we even land? His jaw clenched, we don't, not yet. She pulled the lower, skimming the ridge, weaving through tracer fire that sliced the night. Her gunners opened up, laying down suppressive bursts, carving a narrow breath of space for the defenders below. The helicopter shuddered under impacts. Alarms lit up, but she ignored them. Her mind narrowed into that place she always went, where instinct drowned fear, where the bird felt like an extension of her own body. Coming around again, she called. The defenders saw her now. Their fire steadied. Some waved frantically, signaling. She caught a glimpse of one soldier dragging another through smoke, stumbling but determined. She banked hard, dropped altitude, and hovered just above the compound wall. We're hot, Martinez shouted. Get them moving. Rangers scrambled, hauling wounded, firing upward between desperate dashes. The gunners laid down a wall of lead to cover them. And then the blast. An RPG slammed into the wall below, the shockwave rattling, the nearly flipping it. One gunner screamed into comms. Metal shrieked. The helicopter groaned. Wrestled with the controls, teeth gritted, body straining against the harness. For a second, it felt like gravity itself had betrayed her. But she refused to let go, refused to lose the conversation. Talk to me, she whispered. Stay with me. The machine steadied, barely. More soldiers piled in, bloodied, wide-eyed, some half-dragged, half-carried, the cabin filled with shouts, the stink of smoke and blood. Martinez shouted a count. 10, 12, 14, too many for one load. We're overweight, he barked. We don't leave them, she snapped. We can't lift with. We don't leave them. Her eyes locked on his. The fire in them silenced his protest. He turned back, shouting for the soldiers to press. The helicopter sagged under the weight as she pulled collective. The skids scraped stone. For one heart-stopping moment, the bird refused to rise. Then, like a stubborn friend, it clawed upward inch by inch. Enemy fire shredded the air. A round punched through the windshield, glass spiderwebbing inches from her face. Another tore through the tail. The frame rattled like it was coming apart midair. But she held it. The valley blurred past in streaks of smoke and flame. Every muscle in her body screamed. Her vision tunneled. All she could hear was the bird's groan, the beating of the rotors, and the hammering of her own heart. And then open sky. Silence crashed over her, deafening after the storm. The cabin behind her was chaos. Soldiers gasping, bleeding, some sobbing in relief, some unconscious. Her crew worked furiously, binding wounds, shouting over the noise. But stayed quiet. Her hands shook on the controls, not from adrenaline, from something deeper, something breaking. Because she had felt it this time, the line. The moment when the helicopter almost didn't come back, when instinct wasn't enough, when the laws of weight and gravity and chance almost won. And she realized she couldn't keep asking the sky to forgive her. One day soon, it wouldn't. Back at the base, medics swarmed the survivors. Officers praised her again. The same speeches, the same hollow gratitude. Command clapped her on the back like a tool that had done its job. But she barely heard them. She stumbled back to her quarters and collapsed on the floor, her uniform soaked in blood, not all of it hers. She stared at her trembling hands, trying to steady them, failing. Was this what she had become? A myth to some, a liability to others, and in between a hollow shell of the woman her father raised. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Messages, dozens, survivors thanking her. Soldiers she'd saved sending prayers, promises, blessings. She scrolled through them, her vision blurring. Each word felt heavier than the last. Gratitude that should have lifted her only pressed her further down. Because she didn't feel like a hero, she felt like a fraud. When Collins came to check on her, he found her sitting in the dark, her back against the wall, her eyes hollow. "You did it again," he said softly. She laughed bitterly. "That's the problem." He sat across from her, elbows on his knees. "You can't keep doing this forever." "I know." "Then why?" "Because they'll always ask," she cut in, her voice sharp, raw. "And I'll always say yes. Because if I don't, someone dies, and I can't live with that." Silence hung between them. Collins looked at her, his jaw tight, his eyes heavy. "One day you're not going to come back." She stared at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know." For the first time, she let herself say it out loud. The truth she had been carrying, the truth she could no longer deny. And that night, lying in the darkness, she whispered a thought she had never dared before. "Maybe I'm not meant to survive this." The idea didn't terrify her. It felt almost like relief. Because maybe that was the cost of carrying the impossible. The days after the siege blurred into one another. Briefings, paperwork, debriefs that felt more like interrogations. Answered their questions mechanically, her voice flat, her eyes distant. She wasn't reprimanded this time. Not formally. Not after pulling 21 men out of a collapsing outpost under a storm of fire. Even couldn't frame that as recklessness. Instead, command doubled down on praise. Another commendation. Another case study in adaptive tactics. Another round of pilots whispering her name like it carried weight. But inside she was hollow. She avoided the mess hall, avoided the chapel, even avoided Martinez when she could. Because every time she looked into the faces of those she saved, she felt the fracture inside her widening. Heroes weren't supposed to feel this broken. Her father's words haunted her in the quiet hours. The sky isn't theirs to own. Fly the way it asks you to fly. But lately the sky hadn't asked her anything. It only demanded, take more weight, take more risk, take more lives on your shoulders. And she couldn't say no. It was late one evening when Collins knocked on her door. She almost didn't answer. When she did, he stood there with that look again, the one that carried news too heavy to speak. "They need you," he said simply. She wanted to slam the door, wanted to scream that she had nothing left, but she only asked, "Where?" He stepped inside, unrolling a map on her desk. Pakistani border, Recon team compromised, pinned in a valley. We can't get ground support across fast enough. Air support is restricted. They've been holding out for 2 days. Her eyes scanned the map. The valley was worse than Devil's Throat. Narrower, higher ridges, wind shear recorded at dangerous levels. "Why not call drones?" she asked flatly. "They tried, weather grounded them. This is manned or nothing." Her fingers traced the valley lines. "How many?" "8," Collins said softly. "One of them's an intel officer, high-value target for the enemy. 8 lives, 8 chances, 8 reasons command would come crawling to her again." She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The weight of it pressed down harder than ever. Collins studied her. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do." The answer came before she thought. She hated herself for it. The mission brief the next morning was chaos. Intelligence suggested multiple anti-air positions along the ridges. No confirmed landing zone. Extraction window, 20 minutes. The other pilots didn't even look at the maps this time. They just looked at her, expectant, relieved it wasn't them. Martinez stood beside her, arms crossed, jaw tight. Afterward, when the room emptied, he muttered, "This one feels different." "It is," she said. The prep felt heavier than usual. Every strap, every buckle, every pre-flight check felt like ritual. She moved through it quietly, her hands steady but her chest hollow. Before boarding, she walked a short distance from the hangars, where the mountains stretched into the horizon. The air was cool, sharp, carrying the scent of dust and fuel. She closed her eyes. "If this is the last time, let it mean something." She strapped in, her headset crackling to life. Martinez glanced at her as the rotors roared. "We'll bring them back," he said. She didn't answer. The flight out was long, too long. Hours over jagged ridges, valleys swallowed in shadow. The crew sat silent, each man locked in his own thoughts. The air grew turbulent, crosswinds jerking with sudden jolts. Finally the valley appeared. A scar in the mountains, narrow and twisting, bristling with muzzle flashes. Smoke rose in lazy spirals from the valley floor. Radio chatter came alive. "This is Bravo team, we see you, you're our last shot." Gunfire cracked through the air. Tracers reached upward like claws. Dropped low, weaving through the first bursts of fire. The valley swallowed them, cliffs pressing close on either side. They trembled under the strain, alarms blinking. Her heart hammered. She forced her breathing steady. Every nerve screamed to turn back. But ahead, 8 lives waited. "Hang on," she muttered. The first ridge lit up. Machine guns spat fire. Bullets tore past the rotors. Martinez shouted bearings, the gunners laying down furious streams of return fire. She banked hard, pulling the bird into a maneuver so tight the skids nearly kissed the rock wall. Sparks lit up in the darkness. The helicopter groaned. Still she pushed forward. The valley narrowed further. Crosswinds hammered them, slamming the fuselage sideways. Her teeth clenched. She whispered under her breath, "Talk to me, stay with me." And they answered. Through the turbulence, through the fire, through the chaos, it held. The compound appeared below, barely more than a ring of rubble and dirt. 8 figures huddled inside, firing outward in desperation. 30 seconds, Martinez barked. She dropped the bird into the open pocket of space. Dust swirled. Soldiers rushed forward, hauling the wounded, shouting over the roar. The gunners screamed warnings as enemy fire poured down. 5, 6, 7. "Where's the 8th?" shouted. A figure stumbled from the shadows, limping, dragging a blood-soaked leg. The intel officer. 2 soldiers ran back, grabbed him, half carried, half threw him into the cabin. "Go, go, go," Martinez shouted. Yanked the collective. The bird surged upward, heavy, sluggish, fighting gravity. Tracers slashed across the canopy. An RPG whooshed past, missing by feet. She banked hard, hugging the wall of the canyon, weaving through fire like a ghost. Every second stretched. Every maneuver felt like it might be her last. The shook, rattled, screamed. Her arms ached, her vision blurred, sweat pouring into her eyes. Almost there, Martinez growled. The ridge spat one last fury of fire. Bullets ripped through the tail, alarms wailing. The bird sagged, losing lift. "Come on," she roared. The helicopter clawed higher, defying weight, defying fire, defying everything. And then open sky. The valley fell away behind them. Silence again, broken only by ragged breaths in the headsets. The cabin was chaos, men shouting, some crying, some holding each other in disbelief. The intel officer slumped against the wall, his face pale, his hand clutching hers weakly as he whispered, "You saved us." She didn't answer, because inside, she wasn't sure she had saved anything at all. Back at base, command swarmed. The intel officer was whisked away. Officers praised her again, their words ringing hollow. Another case study, another miracle. But that night sat alone in her quarters, staring at her hands. They wouldn't stop trembling. She thought of her father, her grandfather, Nebraska skis, the freedom she once felt in the air. Now the air only felt heavy. And she realized something terrible. She wasn't flying anymore to save others. She was flying because she didn't know who she was without the weight of impossible missions. And that scared her more than death. Because maybe she wasn't just carrying the myth, maybe she had become it. And myths don't survive forever. The base was quiet that night, too quiet for a place built on war. Sat alone in the hangar, her flight helmet resting on her knees, the looming in the shadows behind her. The bird looked tired, so did she. Her hands still trembled. She rubbed them together as if she could erase the shaking, but it wouldn't stop. Every mission had left a scar somewhere inside her, invisible but heavy. She had saved lives, dozens, maybe hundreds, but she wondered how many pieces of herself she had given away in the process. The door creaked open. Collins stepped inside, his boots echoing in the emptiness. He didn't speak at first, just stood there watching her as though unsure whether to interrupt. Finally, he said softly, "Intel came down. The officer you pulled out, he had information that shut down a major arms pipeline, could save thousands more lives." She didn't look up. Thousands. The word sounded hollow in her mouth. "You did more than save 8 men. You might have changed the whole theater." She let out a bitter laugh. "Funny, they still see me as a liability." Collins walked closer, his voice steady. "Some of them do, some always will. But the ones who came home, they don't care about liability. They only know you showed up when no one else would." She pressed her palms into her eyes, trying to stop the tears threatening to break free. "How many more times can I do this, Collins? How many times can I hold it together before it kills me?" He crouched in front of her, his gaze steady. "That's the choice, isn't it? Keep flying, keep carrying it, or step away before it breaks you." She dropped her hands, staring at him with haunted eyes. "And if stepping away means someone dies because I wasn't there?" Collins didn't answer. There was no answer. The silence stretched until Martinez walked in, his arms still bound, his face tired but alive. He leaned against the bird and said quietly, "They'll never stop asking you, because you make the impossible look possible, but you don't owe them your soul." Her eyes lingered on the helicopter, its frame patched, still standing. She had asked too much of it, just as they had asked too much of her. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if she could walk away, not as a coward, not as someone quitting, but as someone who had given enough. The next morning, she walked into his office. The general barely glanced up, clearly expecting another briefing. Instead, she laid her wings on his desk, the small piece of metal that had defined her entire life. His eyes flicked to them, then to her. "What is this?" Her voice was calm, even. "I'm done. You can't just—" "I can," she cut him off, "and I am." Stared at her, searching for a crack in her resolve. There was none. Finally, he leaned back, his face unreadable. "You'll be walking away from history, Captain." She shook her head. "No, I'll be walking toward myself." And with that she left the office. The news spread fast. Some whispered she'd cracked. Some said she'd burned out. Others said she'd betrayed the gift she had. But the soldiers she had saved, they didn't question it. They sent letters, notes, small tokens. Every one of them said the same thing in different words. "You gave us a chance to live. That's enough." Months later, back in Nebraska, stood in an open field. The wind rolled over the wheat, whispering like the sky itself was breathing. She closed her eyes, the scent of earth and summer thick in her lungs. She pulled her father's old from the barn. The paint was faded, the frame weathered, but it was still airworthy. She ran her hand along the fuselage, the way she had so many times with the... Climbing into the cockpit, she turned the engine over. It sputtered, then roared to life. Familiar, comforting. As the plane lifted off, the field spread out beneath her. The air caught her wings, light and playful, nothing like the crushing heaviness of war. For the first time in years, she wasn't carrying anyone's life but her own. And it was enough. She banked gently, threading between clouds, listening to the air the way her father had taught her. Not as a soldier, not as a myth, just as. Back at the Army Aviation Museum months later, a small plaque was placed beneath her flight wings. It read simply, "Captain who proved that exceptional pilots don't just operate aircraft. They become one with them, creating possibilities where others see only limits." No speeches, no ceremony, just words etched into metal, quiet, lasting. Some called her reckless. Some called her a savior. Some called her the best pilot they had ever seen. But she didn't care about the names anymore. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.